thought that ferns are actually one of the early phases of plant development. Some of them think that they're actually a type of prototype of early plant groups. And today there are over 30,000 different species of plant ferns that can be found all over the world. In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can take care of a fern that you own within your own house or within your own garden. You might be surprised to know that even though there's so many species out there, most of them actually have very similar characteristics that make them kind of have similar requirements for growing inside of your own home. And I'm going to talk you through 3 different factors that you got to consider when growing ferns in your own house. So first one we're going to talk about is the watering. So ferns really like to have a lot of moisture and humidity, and that means that you really need to keep the soil moist and you don't want it to let it dry out between waterings. In fact, there are some species of ferns that actually grow in bogs where they're going to be completely submerged in water all the time. For most people though, you probably don't want to grow a fern that would grow in a bog, or you don't want to grow it sitting in still water. First of all, if you're growing a fern that comes from a bog, then it's probably going to smell not so great, and that can be kind of a turn-off for anyone trying to grow those type of plants. Secondly, if you give your ferns too much water, they can actually become overwatered and their roots will actually start to rot, and that's definitely not a good sign for any plants for that matter, because that will cause the plants to start drooping, wilting, and turning shades of color that you're probably not going to be happy with. The way that you're going to want to water your fern is you want to give the water directly to the stem of the plant. You don't want to spray the water all over its leaves and just kind of pour it all over the place. When water droplets get on your fern leaves, that can cause the sunlight to be magnified and cause your plant leaves to burn, leaving these little black dots or some browning on your leaves. And that's not something that you want to see on your plant. The way that I like to water my fern, I have a fern in my terrarium. I might have shown it in a few videos before. But the way I like to water my fern is I'll actually take a cup of water and just pour it directly under the stems of the fern, and that'll go straight to its roots without having to touch the fern leaves all that much. But I think in the case of a terrarium, I actually don't have to water my fern that much because that water is going to be recycling itself within the terrarium, keeping the humidity levels and the moisture levels constant, which brings me to my next point. We're going to talk about the humidity. The humidity is the second point, the second factor that you want to think about with your fern. Most ferns prefer to have high humidity, and that's going to be a problem in your house if you don't have a humidifier. If you're planning on getting a fern, you're going to have to get creative with increasing the humidity levels such that your fern will be happy growing inside of your home. In my opinion, most homes in most environments typically don't have the levels of humidity required for ferns to grow and be happy. There's a few things that you can do to get the humidity levels up. So the first one, maybe the most obvious one, is to get a humidifier. So you can just buy a humidifier and just plug it in, let the water spray in the air and give your fern a little bit more humidity. And you can just place your fern around that humidifier and that'll probably do fine for your fern. If you want to save energy, you should probably stick with a cold humidifier. You want to use cold water so that it doesn't have to heat up every time. So just be on the lookout for any humidifiers that probably won't take up too much electricity usage. The second way to increase humidity for your fern is to place it over a tray of water, and maybe with some stones in there. When you place your fern above a tray of still water, that water is going to evaporate, turn into water vapors, and essentially increase the humidity right above where that water is. So when I say placing your fern above a tray of water, I don't mean planting your fern into a tray of still water, like just placing the roots directly into a puddle of water or something like that. What I mean by that is you want to place your fern in a pot, whatever pot you're using, place it over a tray of water and have it be above where the water is. You definitely do not want to have those roots sitting in that water. And so one way you can do that is you can get like a grate or maybe like some stones. You want to place that around inside of that tray of water so that when you place your fern over that water, it'll be sitting above that water without having to actually touch that water sitting in that tray. And so by doing that, that water will serve to increase the humidity without having to have your plants get a bunch of root rot and being overwatered. So that's the second way you can increase humidity, just getting a tray of water, placing your fern over it. The third way that you can increase the humidity for your fern is to use a terrarium. So that's actually what I'm doing with my fern. So I got this fern maybe like 6 months ago. I placed it into my terrarium. Terrariums are really good at retaining humidity and keeping high humidity levels. And the way that works is when you place water into a terrarium, it's basically like a sealed container. Nothing really gets in or out. Those water levels is just going to stay inside of the terrarium. It's not going to escape out and evaporate off somewhere. The humidity levels are going to stay constant. And so by doing that, you're going to maintain a very high humidity levels that are great for ferns and also some moss, which I also have in my terrarium. But one word of warning with terrariums, if you don't really have experience with those, you want to avoid giving your terrarium too much water. So if you have your fern in a terrarium, you definitely do not want to be watering it all that much, especially compared to a fern that's growing outdoors or maybe just sitting out in the open inside of your house. Because when the water levels are being kept inside of this container, inside of your terrarium, those water levels aren't going to drop unless there's like an opening in your terrarium. And so every time you add water to your terrarium, you're actually increasing the water levels from where it was before. And if you do that too many times, you're gonna increase it so much that your fern is gonna get overwatered and start rotting, and you're definitely not gonna be happy with that. So one way you can tell you have just the right amount of water is you can take a look at the condensation levels in your terrarium. So if you have just the right amount of water, ideally you should see condensation in your terrarium only a couple times in the day, maybe in the morning and maybe in the evening, but definitely not something like heavy condensation 24/7, so much condensation that you can't even see inside your container. That's the point where you probably have too much water in there. And if that's the case, you should probably open up your terrarium and air it out for a while, let some of that water come out of the terrarium. So that's kind of a tangent, but terrariums are another way you can keep your ferns at a high humidity level. The fourth way that you can try to increase the humidity for your fern is to place it somewhere where there's a lot of running water. What I mean by this is really I'm talking about two places. You could either be your bathroom or your kitchen. Those are typically the places where you have running water. And so in those areas, you're probably gonna have a little bit more moisture up in the air. The humidity is gonna be a little bit higher. And so your fern might enjoy that. And at the same time, it's also right next to a water source, and so it's just kind of convenient, maybe like a mental cue for you to go water your fern a little bit more often. Okay, the third piece that we want to talk about here is the sunlight. So most ferns will do well in indirect sunlight. Actually, out in nature, most ferns like to grow in the shade. So if you ever walk through like a forest or something, most of the ferns that you'll see are just sitting in the shade where it's nice and cool. They're not getting like beaten down by the sun or anything like that. You can probably envision this in your head, but it's kind of hard to imagine seeing a fern growing out in the middle of an open field in the middle of nowhere. I don't think I've ever seen a fern grow intense direct light situations. Most of the time I see them growing off in the shade somewhere under a bunch of trees. That should give you a hint as to how you should be growing your ferns or where you should be placing it inside your home. You want to place it somewhere where it's not going to be blasted by sunlight. You just want it somewhere it has visibility of sunlight but isn't like sitting directly under the open sun or like directly next to a window. So kind of a rule of thumb for that. You don't want to place it off on a shelf in the darkness somewhere. That's probably a little too far, but I would say a good rule of thumb is you want to sit somewhere where you can read a book, but at the same time, somewhere you wouldn't feel like you would need to wear sunglasses. And I think that'd be a pretty good, comfortable place for a fern to grow. Those are the three main factors you want to consider when growing your fern. So the sunlight, the water, and the humidity. There's one more thing you might want to think about is the fertilizer. So fertilizer will help your fern grow a little bit bigger, maybe a little bit faster, but it's not really a requirement by any means. And you most definitely do not want to go overboard on that. So I personally haven't used any fertilizer on my fern, but if I were to throw out a recommendation, I would only put fertilizer on my fern maybe once or twice a year. Maybe like in the springtime when it's growing season for the fern, but I definitely would not do it any more than that. And would keep it really minimal, because if anything, too little fertilizer is definitely going to be way better, going to put you in a better situation than if you put too much fertilizer on your fern. So I'd just be really careful with it and use it cautiously, use it wisely if you want to use that for your fern. So just knowing those three things, that's probably going to give you enough guidance to take care of most ferns. Like I said earlier, most ferns kind of have very similar requirements. And so if you kind of keep those three things in mind, just be mindful of them and just pay attention to those things, then there's a very good chance your fern is going to do well and survive in your house. That's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed it, if you learned something, give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.